I read that book, Breath, and I was like, it is a very strange thing to think about next to your book. Like these do not have the same project, right there. You are not thinking about breath and breathing in the same way as like the people who are like, let us go to the absolute limits of what breathing can do to change our consciousness, right? It's a different project, but it's such a weird book. And I also feel like, I mean, after so many years of like, you know, just breathing through your nose in yoga, I'm like, I'm kind of sold on the like, let's not breathe through our mouths that much. But
Totally.
yeah.
Totally. I'm all for nose breathing.
Yeah. But did you spend some time reading like beyond the Nestor book, like about people who are really like about the Pullmanauts?
Yeah.
How much did that come up?
No, and I actually think that there was something very important in his book for me. I mean, not just the question of nose breathing and breathing that I got interested in, and then like this whole wellness background world, which is slightly on my mind. And I also do yoga, which is in the book. But
I had to actually, I did screenshot a couple of pages and send them to my yoga teacher because I thought she would really appreciate your take on Ashtanga. Like, this is so rigorous and so mean. I have to do it.
Very mean, very rigorous. I didn't, I never became like the most dyed in the wool Ashtangi, but I did appreciate what it did for me for the time that I did it. And I still do it occasionally, but I can't do like 6 times a week Ashtanga. It's not happening. But what was important to me in the James Nestor book on breath was this story of the fact that it's forgotten over and over. And then also the sort of like autodidact, strange, pushing themselves to the limits in all kinds of different ways, these figures that like emerge and that their knowledge doesn't transmit somehow. I got very interested in this, these sort of explorers. And there's something about it that struck me as very psychoanalytic-like. That we have these people pop up and they like reinvent the whole thing, and it like becomes a new therapy or a differently sort of processed work, and then disappears.
Yeah. It's a strange book. I mean, Patrick, you didn't read this, but
I got about halfway through it, actually.
Oh, I was right. I did. But like, there's all this stuff about like taping your mouth shut.
Yeah, when he goes in for the
there's real
spending a month among the mouth breathers or whatever it is. Yeah.
Well, both.
It's like Super Size Me, right? Where he eats like McDonald's every day, so he tapes his nose and only breathes through his mouth and watches himself fall apart.
I was trying to think about breathing stuff. I don't do anything yogic or otherwise, but I was having these
you like to be talked through breath work, actually.
Sometimes, yeah.
I mean, but I feel like I have to sell you on it in terms of like, this is what special forces do.
Yeah, that's very funny.
It's box breathing, like what's
Jocko breathing. Yeah. But I did find myself thinking back to growing up and like going to like day camp when I was very young and driving out like to like way out in New York from the city, having to pass by these enormous like graveyards and that are on like the Long Island Expressway, right? And I remember in the little school bus, like the kids would be like, "No, you have to hold your breath while we're passing graveyards because it's impolite to be breathing when other people can't." And I just remember trying to hold my breath, but some of those cemeteries are absolutely enormous. And then considering, traffic and the way that could be, like it would.
You guys were very considerate children because normally it's that you're going to breathe in a dead spirit and be possessed by them. So you were, you were like honor the dead. That's very nice.
You're listening to Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin.
I'm Patrick Blanchfield.
And today I am so delighted to introduce our guest, Jamieson Webster. Jamieson is a clinical psychoanalyst, professor, and contributor to the New York Review of Books. She is the author of On Breathing, Care in a Time of Catastrophe, out from Catapult this March, which is what we are mostly going to be talking about today. She's also the author of Disorganization and Sex and Conversion Disorder, Listening to the Body in Psychoanalysis. Jamieson, welcome. We're so happy to have you on the show.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
We often like to open with a really, kind of broad question that we like to ask of clinicians and academics. And so take this in any direction that you want. But can you tell us a little bit about your path to psychoanalysis?
Oh my gosh. I feel like I have like apocryphal stories that have been repeated, and I've like gotten to the point that I don't know which is true. There's this discovering Otto Kernberg's book in like a Barnes and Noble on the side of US 1 in Miami at 14 Severe Personality Disorders. I like the title. There's also, I went to college early to a early college place called Simon's Rock, and they assigned Marx, Nietzsche, and Freud, and I was to do Freud and Dora. There's that. And then there was a girl who I admired and looked up to and who totally snubbed me. And I heard that she was reading Lacan. And then I think at some point she got a jouissance tattoo. And then I think I stole her boyfriend. So there's that version too. Maybe I stole her whole identity.
You were like, I'll show you what
Unclear.
lack is.
Yeah, you have her object in your pocket. Wow.
Yeah. So, but I'm one of these weird people who all of this is very early in the day. And after undergraduate, I went straight to graduate school, and I was studying psychoanalysis at the New School, where I now teach. And I did my clinical psychology PhD at CUNY, which is one of the last psychoanalytic programs. And then I was studying Lacan at Après-Coup, and then I went to psychoanalytic training. I just never stopped. It's really sad. I mean, interesting, but at this point I look back and I go, oh wow, people had like lives and I did this, which is okay, but it's a strange choice to make, I think.
I don't know. I mean, I'm looking at you right now. You have a lot of books behind you. That
do.
feels like that feels like a life well lived to me, frankly.
Thank you.
I think a lot, I mean, I actually know because when we posted your book on Instagram, a lot of people were like, wait, when is this coming out? Can we read it? So I know a lot of our listeners are already familiar with your work. And from, the writing that has brought a distinctive psychoanalytic perspective to everything from film, the theater, disability studies, and so much more. So I'm wondering, how did you come to write a book about breathing? There's this moment, this really interesting moment. I always like it when in a book you get an insight into a writer's process, and you talk about how with every book you write, it kind of like tees up the next for you. And so I'm curious as to where this book kind of lives in relation to your other writing, how in particular it's in conversation with your work about hysteria, listening to the body in that way.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it all feels pretty of a piece, the question of hysteria, the question of the body, the question of embodiment, my obsession with the sort of nerdy academic historical aspects of psychoanalysis, and, some auto theoretical aspects of my work. And all of that's certainly at play in this book. And I think the conversion disorder ends with me giving myself appendicitis and having my appendix removed. And this book kind of begins with, tasking myself with working as a palliative care worker during COVID. And that from that were some writings that I did in the New York Review of Books. And whether I was going to expand that or not, Patricia Garavici and I did some work. We wrote some more insider baseball stuff. But something came together when I sort of saw the scene of the birth of psychoanalysis and the kind of origin of the unconscious around the question of breathing. And that Breuer was a pulmonologist and Fliess was, an ENT doctor, and how important that was to Freud and the theory of bisexuality and arousal. And unconscious aspects of evolution. I mean, especially the loss of smell and the exaggeration of our reliance on the visual sphere. And then just all the dudes, then you've got Ronk and Ferenczi and Wilhelm Reich, and then they're all like piling onto this scene. And so I got very excited about that. And my editor, who is very, is like a very handheld process, actually, that I've never been through before. I mean, usually I just kind of write alone and then someone pretends that they're going to come edit. He was like, I'm going to do this with you chapter by chapter. He was not so thrilled with this. I mean, he was like, this is like insider baseball. Like, this is too nudgety. He cut a lot of it, and I've like put things in other places. But that was it for me. I mean, that was what really kind of solidified the project.
One thing that I found myself thinking as I was reading the book was how I had not even thought about like the question of breath in psychoanalysis myself, let alone its relation to sort of like all the different eminently suggestive dimensions in which we could think the breath, whether it's in terms of like the emergent subject or like the fetus or the neonate, or even like the modulation of breath in the production of speech in the strange kind of space that is free association, in this physical space that is the clinical sort of consulting room, and also then, with all the political implications that you take it so productively from there. But just realizing that I had perpetrated that kind of repression myself.
Yeah.
I don't want to make a silly sort of pun in terms of like breathtaking, but I actually found myself following the analysis in a way in which like I was sort of holding my breath and like, oh, this is a thing that actually seems tremendously sort of elemental. And it made me think a lot too about how your inquiry, which ranges, in terms of its psychoanalytic interlocutors far beyond Freud to Winnicott and to other thinkers as well, but also specifically Winnicott for us, because we're coming off this series. The running theme in that has been sort of like, well, who are these ideas for, right? Who are our ideas or our mystifications or our idealized notions of the mother or hate? Like, what do they actually serve, right? Do they help the people they're supposed to help? Or are they descriptive? Or are they about reassuring us? And I encountered in your book this sort of, in addition to like calling attention to the repression of breathing, this sort of recurrent gesture of like, well, who are our ideas about like the fact of breathing, conceptually, but also like literally in COVID wards, et cetera, like, and how we maintain that in terms of relation to, ventilators or even just being in shared space. Who are these ideas for, right? And so I was wondering, like in that mode, like about like, what does the repression serve, or like who was the repression for in some ways?
Wait, hold on. Before you get to, I know you want to go down this rabbit hole, but before you do, because we have read this book, which is not out yet, I want to make sure our listeners get to. No. But I want to see if we can ask you to just talk a little bit more about this central contention before we talk about its implications.
No, it's important.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so let me just kind of put it out in plain language, and also cite just a very brief passage from the beginning of the book. So, I mean, one of the central claims is that breath is one of the primary things that psychoanalysis has forgotten or repressed. Breathing, breath, our relation to air, right? We can hear this claim in a bunch of different ways. And so you write, Jamieson, now I'm quoting, to attend again to something that we have forgotten, isn't that always the task of psychoanalysis, to pry open our amnesias, close quote. So can we ask you to flesh out a little bit this claim about the repression of breathing, and some of its implications, whether for psychoanalysis as a field or beyond?
Yeah, I wanted to add breathing to the amnesias. And, it was evident to me in the history of psychoanalysis that this was repressed either by force or by just, whatever unconscious processes of trying to kind of scotomize something. Because it's so unbelievably present in Freud, and yet he never makes it a central concept. And this is certainly the case already in Jung and Ronk and Ferenczi. I mean, it's there in them, and yet they never really centralize it in any way, shape, or form. And it's even reduced to something like, birth trauma, which somehow like misses the question of what it means to leave a certain environment and then have to take up existence in another environment, which includes air and includes a new dependency. If the dependency was originally on the body of the mother, then the dependency is on air. But that dependency on air is an interdependency between all people. And this just sort of slips away. And what you hear is a kind of ideological claim for like the individual, like me and my individuated self, that somehow gets away from the real heart of the breathing question and the fragility of it. And the fragility of it was overwhelmingly apparent to me in the COVID hospitals, and then also obviously in the political events following it with George Floyd and I Can't Breathe. And this attack that something about it, the fragility of it, the precariousness of it, the obviating of our interdependency makes it a place for anxiety and attack. And, what I wanted to do was add breathing and air to the list of amnesias, which includes sexuality and, as a Lacanian or someone interested in Lacan, language. And, all three are intimately linked. If Freud brings to the table sexuality, and it took Lacan to kind of really bring the implications of language to the forefront of psychoanalysis, even though they're obviously there. But I mean, he pushes it, and he talks about how language is a trauma, and that we have to incorporate something foreign. And for Freud, I think that what he means by the difficulties with sexuality is that it's foreign to us, not just because we can't handle it in children, but the child has to experience Ferenczi style a sexuality that's foreign to it, which is the parent's sexuality, which is of another time and of another place. And I think this is true with breathing as well. It's foreign. I mean, we have to take, Lacan has this brilliant quote. I don't have the book in front of me, but he says that we have to take something foreign into our bodies and accommodate that foreignness. So you have like a model then, and you also have a model for something of the rhythmicity of all of the erotogenic drive life and the impossibility of that rhythmicity. And this was my upset, or a little bit of my bone to pick with some of what goes on in the world that loves breathing, which is it acts as if there's a natural, authentic breath that can be restored.
Let's just get back to that, how we're supposed to breathe. Yeah.
Whereas I think it's a psychoanalytic problem, actually. There's no like supposed to. Like the breathing is like a weak link, just as sexuality is and just as language is in us. And we don't know what's going to happen. And certainly with climate catastrophe, how we're going to adapt to this, how we're already, these mouth breathers. This is what's so funny about the James Nestor book. Is like, he paints this portrait of us just like, our mouths are collapsing, our larynxes are falling even deeper into our throats. At some point it's, as if our entire faces are going to collapse.
Yeah.
So what will become of us?
Yeah. I also think it's not a coincidence that the book begins with birth, right?
Mm-hmm.
And this, the beginning of taking this foreign thing, as you say, into the self on the part of the baby who has just been, thrust into the world. I was thinking, and then of course you got to, I was thinking a lot about Luce Irigaray as I was reading the book. And then, somewhere in the middle, you get to that book, The Forgetting of Air, and Martin Heidegger, and which is part of, a bigger series where she accuses male philosophers of forgetting all of the elements. Like Nietzsche, you've forgotten the ocean, right? I'm kind of forgetting what the rest of them are, but I don't know, that part was interesting to me here. It reminded me also of like Judith Herman, too, talking about sort of like the ways that we keep forgetting, the way that psychoanalysis keeps cyclically forgetting trauma, and specifically gendered trauma. But yeah, there is this kind of loose association between breath and the feminine. Like, I didn't see it as you wanting to make that claim in some sort of like strong ontological sort of way that like this is the forgetting of the feminine, in the way that, Irigaray wants to say that to everyone from Plato to Freud. But I think am I wrong to think that's there too?
No, I think it's there. It's certainly there in the question of birth trauma, where all of these men are fighting about the perfect non-traumatic birth, and the mother and her place in this, and her breath labor on behalf of the child and her separation from the child and the negotiating of that over and over and over, and also living bathed in the breathing of the infant, the talking to the infant, the swaddling of the infant in language. Like, this is just this is just like erased from the story of like the perfect liberatory, independent, moment for the child who one assumes is male in that moment. So I think that there's a claim for something of the feminine within the domain of repressions more generally. The writing of this book took place during the first year of my daughter's life. So a lot of this was very much on my mind. And even the repression factor is amazing. This morning I was looking at videos with her of her infancy, and I forgot that when she, kind of later down the line, when she was breastfeeding, she would like blow and make noises at the breast. She'd sit there and she'd be like, doop, 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 doop. And I caught it on video, but I forgot this. And I thought, how could you forget? And I also I could hear my absolute pleasure in, capturing this moment. And I thought, how could you forget something that you loved this much? And just that, I love this attention in psychoanalysis to what, slips out of your purview, no matter how, I don't know how long I've been in analysis, no matter how much I attend to these things, they can just slip away. This is endlessly fascinating to me. And there's something about that with breath. And I think people, will read the book and then they'll start trying to attend to their breath and they'll go crazy. Like in the beginning of analysis, when you try to pay attention to yourself too much.
On a related note, sort of this idea of how an attention to breathing kind of exposes you to like your own vulnerability, but also to the vulnerability of others in this way. And the sequences in which you read sort of Ben Lerner having sort of panic style, like having a experiences that made me want to have a panic attack by proxy. I'll say
me
that.
Too,
yeah,
man.
About,
and we don't even have kids.
About his daughter choking, right? And
Yeah.
and I, again, talk about like repressed memories. I suddenly found myself thinking back to, and this is sort of inverts it though, to like being taken care of by my grandmother, right? And like sleeping at her place occasionally. She helped raise me. And then she'd go to sleep, and she was very old even at the time. But to me as a child, I thought she might have been a million. Listening to her breathing and being so afraid that she was going to stop breathing, right? Because like the old person kind of represented this, like at any moment it could stop. And I remember just being like, Tara, I can't be here. It's like, I'm so worried. Like Bobby's just going to go. And I don't know, it felt like something that is both foundational to be attuned to, but that also being attuned to it, like could produce a kind of madness, right? And then it when it's within the frame of parental preoccupation or maternal preoccupation, it seems to be good to have that attunement, but also too that kind of something about that the gaze turning inward in that way was into like the breath dimension of this thing psyche, which already has these etymological senses of breath. Was, well, to put it crudely, crazy making, or could be.
Except for when you think, just in the kind of retrospective memory that was the process of writing this book, you are hyper attuned to it as a kid.
Yeah.
That's just what I started to remember. And it was shocking to me how much having a cold, having a stepped up nose, thinking of not breathing, thinking of breathing fast, holding your breath at the cemetery, getting winded on your bike. This was just such a huge part of childhood. Again, like sexuality that somehow vanishes in adult weirdness. to put a very technical term on neurosis.
Well, there's also something, and I'm really thinking out loud here. I guess I'm always thinking out loud, but there's something about like the breath as an autonomic function, right? But also as something that you can control. I remember, like probably a few years into becoming like pretty serious about yoga, like finally being able to understand what my yoga teacher was talking about when she was like, the breath is like a dial you can turn up. Like, and it's like you can actually like make a thing that's hard a little easier. Not easy. I think it's so, and this is maybe why I'm also interested in the pulmonauts, is like, there's something very seductive about the idea that you could take over from this thing that also functions without you.
Yeah.
Right? There's a fantasy of control.
But as you know, in yoga, it's not that you control the breath, it's that you enter a different space with what is uncontrolled. And I
Yes.
think that that's very similar to psychoanalysis. And I think the invitation to go in and control this uncontrolled thing or ignore it completely, um, or kill it, that's the interesting question. And the fact that breath work of various kinds tries to go into that space
Yeah.
without trying to control, but with working with it, because most of the time we're not.
Yeah.
And I think it's the same. I mean, that's my sense of psychoanalysis is that it's very similar. Although I do, in the breathing speaking thing, which I'm sure we'll talk
Yeah,
about,
absolutely.
I do want to diverge from the breathing practices, because I don't think that the question of speaking enters into the territory.
Yeah, I mean, that to me is one of the most distinctive parts of this book, and the way that you are like really clearly diverging from folks who are like, let us work first with the somatic, right,
Yeah.
dimension in an attempt to, do X with the breath in order to have Y output, right? And I will say that, for me, breath work, like, it is something that I try to be cognizant of in terms of one of the terms that's important for you in the book, which is anxiety. And that, we do know that there's certain things that you can do to action. I hate using that as a verb, but I'm going to do it anyway. Like action certain breathing within your body to change certain kind of affective states. But I guess you're giving me a segue to talk about two terms that really structure the book. The first of which is anxiety, and the other one of which is asphyxiation. And so I want in this connection to note for our listeners that one of the most crucial elements of On Breathing is the way that it not only makes claims about the way breath helps us to understand interdependence, but that it also is toggling continually between this arena of the individual and the arena of the social and political. So breath is about individual life and speech, absolutely. But it's also thought here in relation to COVID and in relation to the way that that violent agents of this state kill the most vulnerable among us, both literally and metaphorically choking the life from people. So I'm hoping that you can talk to us a little bit about anxiety and asphyxiation, how you're thinking them, and how they structure your thinking about breathing, as well as, the way that they structure the book.
I mean, wellness industry, I think kind of what it's targeting and sending you, at least my algorithm, all of the apps that you can download for breathing is the feeling that we're all having of like incredible anxiety. And, whether it's the fact that we're paying attention to the anxiety or the anxiety is obviated in discourse, I'm not sure whether we have more anxiety than other people. I'm always like a little loath to make claims about what's more or less than the past, because that's tough. But certainly, at least at the moment, the consumption of breath work is in relationship to anxiety. And so my question was, what is anxiety in psychoanalysis, or what's the psychoanalytic take on this? And lo and behold, there's everyone with the birth trauma theories, that the first moment of anxious entering into the world is a moment of the experience of having to breathe. And then questions of choking or like the increased rhythmicity in the body that like evokes something about suffocating, is a big part of the experience of anxiety. And we know that like anxiety is healing itself in a way when it has a symbolic transformation. So someone with an actual phobia, like I'm afraid of snakes, helps the person who has diffuse anxiety because it concentrates it somewhere. And this is very important in psychoanalysis, which you don't hear. So while the breath work is trying to like calm the person down, psychoanalysis is trying to do a much more radical transformation, which is to take a bodily diffusion and force it into a symbolic representation of some kind, or force it into the symbolic, as it were. I mean, as Lacan put it, like you need a symbolic overlay on the world, otherwise it's just terrifying. And, for some, it's as if it's not there, or it needs to, like help get propped up in some fashion. And that's the psychoanalytic work. That psychoanalytic work is very different from work on already formed symbols, which is often how conversion disorder and hysteria is thought of, which is that there are certain symbols that have an embodied bodily traumatic element and stand in for a whole number of trains of thoughts and experiences that are repressed that the analyst deconstructs. And I think that this is very hard for analysts because one work goes one way and one work goes the other way. And like, when do you know someone's an anxiety hysteric versus a hysteric? And, also, Freud was very worried about anxiety, and he felt it wasn't just the analyst's responsibility to help the anxious, but it was society's. It was the onus should be on society that has to provide a framework so that people aren't just overwhelmed by physiological distress, right? And that they can insert themselves into a representational framework that gives them some orientation in their life. And the fact that the analyst has to come and try to prop something up, is like, he was upset. He's like, there's not going to be enough of us, frankly. And this is like, he got these weird theories of the coitus interruptus. Like, he was worried that people were having like bad orgasms, and this was making them all like have actual neurosis. And that this would be like, this would lead to war. This would lead to, violence, mental disintegration, physiological disintegration, which is true. So, one question about now is like, are we at a tipping point, the shredding of the social fabric? And that's when I start to move into the question of asphyxiation. And that's when it broadens out to like a much more social question. And I have to say, I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Sloterdijk, along with Irigaray and a couple of philosophers, Achille Mbembe and his The Universal Right to Breathe, because they have been thinking of the transition from the 20th century into the 21st century as a question in relationship to air, which was wild to me. I mean, they're idiosyncratically tackling it from very, very different angles, but they all have a feeling that something, not just climate catastrophe, but jet travel, airplanes carpet bombing cities, not just the sort of older attacks directly on the body, but the way that there's somehow a confusion on the attacks that we might have made on a person's body and against their breath that now become a destruction of their environment, in which you attack many people's breath at the same time. And it really paints an incredibly dark portrait, which like drives us up to this COVID moment and the strange time in which we find ourselves, especially since we now have the president from that time in office again. And I can't, I don't know what. I'm not like a hope giver, but I think it's an important picture to give, however hopeless it is, and maybe to find in there some of the places for maneuvering. But you have to recognize the problem. And so again, with this question of the repression, I was surprised. I was surprised that it was so coherent.
I found myself thinking in a way that your thinking sort of shook loose too. Some of the research I've done over the years about the theory and history and sort of concrete tactical application of like tear gas and not quote unquote non-lethal chemical agents and the almost like psychoanalytically cunning, though it never speaks itself in these terms, sort of ways of both concretely deploying these substances in spaces, whether it be to make a crowd like regress, right? Because obviously having, I don't know, like Nigerian women or practitioners of like Gandhi style nonviolence in India, like simply occupying space makes for terrible optics if we go in there to crack their heads with cops. So instead you find documents, in these colonial archives that like, well, if we gas them, everyone freaks out and then they behave as though they were, a primal horde. And some of this language really does come close to that. Right.
Yeah.
But also too, just thinking about it in terms of these sort of kettle logic contortions come to like a pressure cooker boiling point during the height of the beginning of the COVID pandemic, and also its intersection with all the sort of the policing measures, where there were these strange sort of litigations, individual and collective, of like, well, should you go out to protest, right? Should you yell when you're protesting? Should you be masked when you're protesting? And then meanwhile, the cops are like, no, well, we're going to gas you, and then we're going to take the masks off you, and we're going to throw you in a paddy wagon so you can all share space. And then people sort of meta outside that, being like, well, if you care about this, then you shouldn't be protesting at all. You should be doing it digitally, right? These kind of processes of metabolizing either the horror of vulnerability to shared space and to our own dependence on our breathing apparatus, or sort of kind of cynical manipulations of that. It felt like one of those points in which repression has, like, it's too full of senses, right? Both as a psychic mechanism of erasure, but also like literally, this is how the boot comes down, right? This is how you have people in a space and you gas them, and then horrible things happen, but it looks like it's their fault.
Yeah, and I didn't know that gas chambers were invented in America before they were used in World War II by National Socialism. I mean, that's a wild fact. And then in the writing of the book, we killed the first person with helium, I think. There's a new method that they're trying to use for capital punishment. And, so just the fact that I don't know, that you keep running into this, the metaphorical or the structural, and then the instrumentalizing of it, I guess, in reality. And the story that also struck me a great deal was Wilhelm Reich, because he's the great, he's the great writer on the question of fascism, and yet what he ends up doing with the breathing and the orgone and the commune and the alien enemies and the curing of the cancer becomes itself so absolute. And, there's the moment in which I talk about Marcuse saying that this administration of happiness is nauseating to me. And it's heartbreaking, because the 60s, or whatever that moment would be the bid for liberation, and then its reversal into its opposite. And Lacan, I guess, was more skeptical in that moment. But these liberatory motifs, and the way that they're so locked into an individual logic, and we're still struggling so much with this, and that seems to be very, very much at the heart of the breathing question. And in a way that I like, because I think when we think of sexuality in psychoanalysis, there's a lot that's trying to, at least, especially if you're like a Freudo-Lacanian person, the no sexual relationship, the triadic, don't go into this space of imagining complementarity, this trying to push the person towards some kind of acceptance of like loss and aloneness. But, this reverses the trajectory in a way that's, I think, is very nice, more towards the relational and the social.
Yeah, just two quick things on this note. That bit of James Baldwin on Reich, I'd never encountered that before, and it's just amazing. I'm just going to read this line for a
Yes, please.
They had not become more generous, but less, not more open, but more closed. There are no formulas for the improvement of the private or any other life, certainly not the formula of more and better orgasms. Who decides? The people I had been raised among had orgasms all the time and still chopped each other up with razors on Saturday nights, that was just amazing to me. But also, and I think in a kind of related mode, the line of Lacan's that you bring to bear about sort of the linkage between freedom and madness.
Mm-hmm.
And I found myself thinking about that too, in relation to these sort of notions of like sovereign individuality, but also of like impermeability, and of a kind of like a type of transaction that I feel people, or that passes for a politics in some ways, where people are like, well, essentially, like, you're wearing a mask is a violation of my freedom, right? Or in an even more crude way, these ways in which I think you could understand a lot of the a certain account of like right-wing ideology, or even classical liberal ideology, right? It's like in the US, at least, it's like, well, the things that I put in your body, right, whether they be bullets or, semen or pollutants, that's an expression of my freedom and your problem.
Mm-hmm.
It's always going elsewhere, right? Someone's always downstream of the smoke, or they're the ashtray that you're rubbing the cigarette on, or whatever, right? And it is freedom, but it's also a kind of madness. And thinking about just like the successive like the physical corrosion of shared space and this sort of vicious capacity for our social order to like, allow people to travel with, bottled air or their own setups, like their advanced teams, like Joe Biden had to like install massive HEPA filters whenever they give a talk, versus people who are, in the streets or, in carceral situations where they're confined and breathing worse and worse air is clearly something about freedom in terms of the former reinscribes the sort of the choking out of the latter in this kind of viciously cyclical way.
Yeah, when I first wrote about the breathing in COVID in the New York Review of Books, I discovered in Lacan's Logical Time essay, which you often think of as like the neurotic person finally like seizing their desire and destiny, or whatever. I've gotten very annoyed with this aspect of Lacan. But actually, if you read the essay, it's remarkably about interdependency. Because even though that's necessary, like that you have to understand something about the time that is your time, that you spread out into some idea of like comprehension via others and on your own, you have to make a decision about your movement that there will never be a direct leap from what you know or what another person's doing that will allow you to understand what it is that you need to do. Nevertheless, at that moment that you understand what you need to do, there's still lots of people around who might want to go with you, who might want to impede you, who might want you to explain yourself, who might say like, no, you can't actually do what you want to do. And I think it became a very funny way of thinking of his Logical Time essay, which often can feel heroic, and actually realizing that, Jesus, it takes you this much to get out of your neurotic loop. And then there's all the people, and then there's the world, and then there's like history. And so I sort of love this, especially within the madness of we were in like a deep historical unknown situation in the way that everyone just got in each other's face in this argumentative way about, what their conception of freedom was, as free from everyone else at the moment that we were certainly not free from anybody for the first time, and really understanding that. So that was very important to me, I think, in the story of writing this book, and then rediscovering this within the history of people like Reich and James Baldwin and other thinkers.
Yeah, I found this to be one of the most interesting and like kind of at first counterintuitive, but then on second reflection, not like moves, is because I think you could, think that there would be an argument about increased attentiveness to breath and air, takes us to increased attentiveness to relationality and interdependence, which is going to take us towards more freedom. And your book is like, no, that's not where we're going. Like you make that first move, but that second one, especially not freedom in the sense, this book is very skeptical of ideas of the sort of like discrete autonomous individual. It is not about like increasing the freedoms of that conception of the person.
Yeah, and all those, all the areas of the repressions, whether it's sexuality, air, and language, are unbelievably burdened at the same time that they're open. And it's the openness of them that's terrifying. And I don't, what freedom are you going to find in that? Something historically burdened and painfully open. And so, how do you then find your way with it becomes, I think, the question. And then the very end of that is about language, which I think is the hardest.
Well, you're queuing me up beautifully to ask the next thing that I wanted to, both with that point and by bringing up Lacan, because clearly this text is so informed by Lacan, though, as Patrick pointed out, there are so many other figures that are really important here. And I'm thinking about your I don't want to say animus exactly, but like towards breath as thought or peddled by the wellness industry.
Mm-hmm.
And part of that, it seems to me, is the way that is just linked to the somatic in a way that ignores speech, right? And the way that air and breath are so integral in the production of speech. And so I'm hoping that, and maybe this is in some ways about a very distinctively psychoanalytic conception of freedom. I'm hoping you can talk to us a little bit about how thinking about breath helps us with what you frame as the imperative of psychoanalysis, which you phrase as to, quote, say everything, say anything.
One of my favorite moments in the book was when I was talking about Patricia Lockwood's No One's Talking About This, which
I loved that book.
I love that book. I love her. And
what a painful piece of writing.
Very, very painful. And the end of it, when she says that if they looked on her phone, they would see a picture of the baby, and the baby in her book is a baby that was destined to die within the first 6 months of its life. And they would see it opening its mouth, about to say something, because the baby never made it to the point of speaking. And she reversed the psychoanalytic imperative, which was like, say everything you can say, in the desire of the parent, mother, I don't know, parent, looking to their child for the moment that they'll speak and what they'll say. And I think there's, there again, there's more of a kind of relational aspect of the listening, speaking, and interdependency there that I think is really foundational. And the paradox is also within the free association, because, we all know you say to the patient, say what comes to mind, and they can't do it. And then they can't do it, and they can't do it, and they can't do it. And then, part of what they find out in the free association is that they're not freely speaking. They're speaking within very, very tight constraints and a great deal of overdetermination. And, the Ferenczi joke is that when you can free associate, you can end your analysis. But, even that, it's not like the end of analysis is liberatory. I mean, even Freud depicts it as like a crashing down to earth, I think, in a certain conception. So I think that's a big part of it. And, Lacan, the important thing for me in Lacan, and I didn't go into any like deep Lacanianism in this book, because it's like meant for more of a popular audience. But since we're speaking, I mean, his insistence that we're always within a linguistic framework, and that a lot of the pre-Oedipal obsessions and machinations in psychoanalysis like want to believe that there's a pre-verbal time, but you're born into language, you're swathed in language, it's always there, and once you incorporate it, there's no going back. And he really wanted to emphasize that. And I think something that's not brought up enough is that language is nonsense. It's noises. It's breath. It's sounds that we're sitting there trying to put together and to make meaning of. And this is how we're all crazy. And that the experience of the child is much closer to the fact that you don't understand what the hell anyone is saying to you. And that we are all a bit psychotic because of this. It's not like you're psychotic and then you get language and then you're neurotic. There's something psychotic in language. And there's something impossible in language. And I wanted to bring that out. And I think when you attend to the breathing of it, or you attend to the rhythmicity, or you attend to the way in which the body is so present in speech, you get away from the understanding and the ideas and the knowledge that you think is there in it. And that has been a huge part of the atrocity of, I don't know, you can't be completely anti-knowledge, but I think we have to have some sense of the way in which knowledge and colonialist empire building go together. And that right now with the internet and the age of information that we're in, and the AI and the obsession with where knowledge is going to get us, while we do not attend to the very basic foundations of what it means to be a human being and live together and have a reasonable life. This is the stark separation that I wanted to bring up at the very end. And, my sort of nasty little jibe at the wellness industry is like, where do you think you guys are going with your breath therapies as you ignore all of this, and the ways in which we have to kind of confront within language and breathing the transmissions of what we think the human project is.
As you said, it is a book that is geared towards a variety of audiences, but also, I think, encompassing clinicians and academics as well as the general public. And there are, some of the parts that I found the most powerful are these personal narrative elements, especially, starting from the beginning of the book, you talking about your work as a hospital volunteer in the early days of the pandemic, as well as the case studies that dot the book. And there are some, really memorable moments, like when you're like, it is a really strong taboo to not touch a patient, but here I had to, because she, in this way that was intimately related to like the inability to breathe, right? And one of the things that has been a real joy about doing Ordinary Unhappiness is how many of our listeners work in healthcare, not just as analysts or therapists, but in so many different roles, and we hear from them a lot. So I'm curious as to what you might want folks who are working with patients, because we haven't really talked that much about clinical implications. I mean, the clinical implications even of thinking, when you hear speech that you are attending to breath, like that's, so I'm really curious about what you might want folks working with patients or who are patients themselves to take away from on breathing.
It's a good question. I mean, the fact that breathing makes one anxious, another person's labored breathing, another person's sound making, intonation, fast paced talking, too slow talking, tick talking. That we have very visceral, I think, reactions to this on a bodily level, and that we could get interested in that. Again, to get out of the cycle that Patrick was saying of violence in relationship to this. And then actually what's interesting, and also with respect to ourselves, because I think the unique signature of a person is there. I think that's like when we love a writer, like I love Patricia Lockwood, it's something about her strange rhythmicity. It's maybe not even the ideas, but it's something that you pick up from the rhythmicity with which she writes. And, the same would be the case for dance, or the same would be the case for a brushstroke. And so this whole sublimatory domain, this is the best and the most unique and the most diverse picture that I think psychoanalysis can give of the human being. And, Freud's idea of civilization is that civilization manages to figure out how to encompass this diversity. We're not doing very well at the moment, and we're going to deport all of the diversity or make it illegal. But Freud's idea was that our pleasure, unpleasure, enjoyment, bodily life, history, every single person is unique, and society is trying to do its best to allow this diversity to exist, and we don't. This is what we have to understand. We don't like it. When I'm angry at my partner, I think that like his way of doing things like should just, like not exist on the planet. And, we
Don't
have
give
to
me that look, Patrick.
It's amazing to think of this. I mean, there's like sections in the book where I talk about this aggressivity against the other person.
Yeah.
And I think it's about their enjoyment. And it's about the way that it comes to you in their body. So I hope that that this is an important message across all fields, not just psychoanalysis, that it has a lot to do with what we love and what we hate, and what we love hate or hate love, as the kids like to say. And we got to get interested in it, or it's going to crash us, I think.
I thought a lot about the idea of the body speaking, and I know we haven't we talked about Irigaray for momentarily, but another figure who I thought about a lot in reading this was Julia Kristeva, who's not using the word symbolic in the same way as Lacan exactly, but who, when you were talking before, I was thinking about the sounds that your daughter made that you forgot. This idea of the semiotic, right? That like, our ability to symbolize would essentially be, I mean, when I read Julia Kristeva for the first time, there was no AI in any meaningful way, but like ChatGPT is the symbolic without the semiotic, right?
Yeah,
in
right.
some sort of way. And I do feel like it's not a didactic book at all. It's held together by this idea of breath, but it really moves in so many ways, through your experiences, through so many textual encounters that were clearly meaningful to you through clinical experiences. But for me, and I shared Patrick's sense that like I had trouble breathing sometimes while I was reading this book. Because I was paying too much attention to it. But it did make me think about how, we don't talk about that idea of the semiotic so much, about the sort of like non-linguistic elements within signification, without which signification is, I guess, a dead letter, and I don't treat patients. I'm not a clinician, neither is Patrick, but I do work with people. And it did make me think about the ways in which, without consciously reflecting on it, how much I don't know if I'm looking for breath, but that sort of sense of like the way the body shows itself to others as it makes its way into language that is distressed or that is joyful, or that, I don't know, it's just, I really appreciated the way that the book doesn't make you choose. I mean, and I think this is true of psychoanalysis often, but we end up going in one way or another. We can refuse Descartes as much as we want, but we still kind of live in the legacy of Descartes. And for me, psychoanalysis has always been such a fertile space to think with, because it insists on the interrelationship of psyche and soma. But sometimes psyche can really become, sometimes soma drops out. And I think this insistence on breath is like such a lovely corrective.
Thank you. Thank you. That was my hope. And I love Lalonde. I mean, like the Lacan pushed this question, which I think Braca Ettinger picked up and Kristeva picked up, and very important women analysts late in the day, Michelle Montrellet. And their listening as analysts is unique to me. And, it's interesting. Sometimes I present that work, or I present my own work to other analysts who don't, who are more within the realm of interpretations and ideas and recovery of experiences. And I think they think that I'm insane, because you're interested in a strange repetition of sounds, and you think that it's everything. You think that it's the important key. And, you say it back to a patient, and it can be very hard if you're like, you're trying to pick up something that's there, that's on the level of the semiotic. And, the patient's a little like, what's crazy lady doing today? But you believe in it, and you believe that it's kind of interpretation or marking or pushing is what has an effect in the treatment. And, you have to be a little bit witchy that way, I think. And, we want to be not outside of understanding or knowledge, but we really want to be only on the edge of it. And so when you say something about not having to choose, I feel like it's about that occupying that space, not quite fantasy, not quite reality, not quite within the domain of information and knowledge and veridical truth, but not quite just, completely thinking that things are arbitrary or gone. And that you can just make up your own reality, like really trying to stay in that space. And that's the perspective of the analyst, that you can't prove it. You just have to do it.
The hospital is all over this book, even in the moments that you're not explicitly talking about the hospital. Like, as you said, it begins with the birth of your daughter, but it also begins with your work in COVID. Would you feel comfortable talking a little bit about what it was like to be a volunteer in, I think it was 2020, right?
Yeah.
In those hospital wards as an analyst? Because I guess I see, the hospital is sort of is everywhere, and you show up and as an analyst, but you also show up as a mother.
Yeah, what's my thing with hospitals? I mean, I have a mother who's a doctor who went to medical school while I was a child, far away from me, and then I would go visit in medical school. And she has 8 brothers and sisters, 7 of whom are doctors. So the hospital is a looming signifier in my life. But I mean, I also do think of the analyst as someone who has to move into these incredibly fraught, vulnerable spaces where life and death is a question. And the hospital is one, but I think also within the book are places of war. Yeah. So this is sort of like war and hospital are these zones in which you leave your office, I guess. And it's not the first time. So my partner accuses me of rubbernecking chaos or being like a trauma tourist or something. But I also worked in 9/11. I was a first responder. So I have like a history of this, and I loved working in inpatient hospitals. And I've visited lots of different versions of inpatient hospitals, very curious about how they set themselves up and treatment of like severe psychosis. So I'm really interested in these spaces where I think everyone's has something to do. Like we gotta help the situation. We gotta make sure these people live. But there are the kinds of attentions of the psychoanalyst to what's happening there. What's happening when life and death is in question? Like, how are we addressing this person? How are we not addressing this person? Like, where's the subject? Where's the subject being erased? And the example that really moved me, especially when I was trying to figure out what was going so wrong in the hospital, because the scene was bad. And I think that was my question. Like, why is it so violent? Why is everybody having an anxious breakdown? Like, I get it. It's a pandemic. We're all afraid of dying. But there's something extra. And that's what I wanted to understand. And Catherine Vanier's book, and I've loved her, as an analyst who goes into the hospital. So she's there in the NICU with the preemies, and she says there's something psychoanalytic to attend to here. Yes, there's the preemie, and we have to, help them survive, and we have the parents who are worried. But there's something psychoanalytic that's not just addressing the parents' anxiety, but the whole question, the staff, the baby, the parents, and where speaking and not speaking is happening. And that was my question in the hospital. Like, something was not being spoken about with respect to these patients struggling to breathe. And the whole country was obsessed with intubators. And I was watching, and I started to read pulmonology articles that these patients could breathe without being intubated. But I was watching in the hospital them not let this happen because they could not deal with the labored breath and the anxiety around it. And then on the other side of it, a psychosis question, which is very important to me, came up, which was that the patients who were put into intubation were becoming psychotic. I mean, one, they're on heavy medication, but also the ICU. And then when they come out of intubation, they would emerge and sometimes be completely psychotic. And we didn't know whether it was COVID, whether it was the intubation, whether it was the isolation, the confusion, but they were completely psychotic, and then no one could handle that. So on either end of this intubation process, it was unbearable for the staff. And what you wanted was a patient who was sedated. You just wanted a patient who wasn't there. And I think this was really the scene for me, the kind of primal scene of the book. And I, at a certain point, because I was volunteering and I felt like I was useful, when I wanted to be more useful to what I found very violent in this scene, and I tried to talk to the the heads of the hospital, they were not interested in listening to me. And then I thought, oh, well, this is a business, and they're happy to sacrifice my life. And they don't want to hear what I have to say. So I really felt unuseful at that point. I felt like this was not what had been there for me in the beginning, and coming to be there was slowly subsiding. And, people were being allowed to see their loved ones also at that point. So the function that I was serving in mediating between people who couldn't be with their loved ones who were sick and dying in the hospital, that was less necessary. And the systemic questions were huge. And I think the fact that I had this kind of interrupted labor there, okay, well, I couldn't do anything about something I wanted to do something about, made me also want to write the book and think more about these systemic issues going forward. Hence the Sloterdijk. I laugh about Sloterdijk because it was like 5,000 pages. I don't know if you know his Spears trilogy. It was 5,000 pages.
There is something about, like, I don't know, and I'm struggling to articulate it, but this idea of the air as shared space, as medium, as this thing that it's one of those things you paradigmatically really appreciate once it's gone, right? Or once it's a question, or once it's once your capacity to take it in has been compromised one way or another. And here I'm thinking my own experiences with COVID as well. And it just, I feel like what I want to say is that reading the book, it made that kind of this sort of medium that I think can be taken as a vacuum, right? That it's not even perceived somehow. It made me feel it in a different way. And I know I'm going to be coming back to the way it made that the question of breathing both so uncanny and yet so trenchant in all these different domains. And so I'm just expressing my gratitude really to you for writing this lovely book.
Jamieson, thank you so much for talking with us today. Is there anywhere people can catch you, other writing that we should look out for, tour dates, anything along those lines?
There's a couple, there's 3 cut pieces from the book that I'm publishing. So the conclusions on Marion Milner are published in Broadcast magazine, which is connected to Pioneer Works. And then a piece on Althusser, who strangled his wife, is published in Ursula. They're going to make it digitally available closer to the release of the book. And then
awesome.
The long piece on Otto Rank that sadly was cut will be in Parapraxis.
Oh,
wonderful.
For those. And then at the Brooklyn Public Library, there's a launch with Gia Tolentino on March 11th. And then at Pioneer Works, April 13th is a conversation with Leslie Jamieson. But I also brought in an artist named Andros Sins Brown, who I love, who has something called the Chaos Opera, which he talks about. He starts with like a kind of somatic moment with the group, but then he goes into, we have to sing together, but not sing as one, sing together, but differently. And he sort of orchestrates it, like everyone's like making noises and they start to vary each other and they start to like go off and someone introduces something and someone might pick it up a little bit. And I've done it with him once and I like fell in love with it. So, to do the breathing speaking thing, this was like my really exciting event coming up.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure. And I'm going to be thinking about the book for a long time.
Truly,
thank you. Thank you for reading it.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ordinary Unhappiness. Ordinary Unhappiness is completely made possible by our community of Patreon supporters. If you want to help keep the show going and keep it ad-free for everyone, plus get 2 additional episodes per month, come on over and find us at patreon.com/ordinaryunhappiness. This has been an episode of Ordinary Unhappiness, a podcast about psychoanalysis, politics, pop culture, and the ways we suffer now. I'm Abby Kluchin, and today I was joined by Patrick Blanchfield and Jamieson Webster. This podcast is produced by Dan Yowell. Theme music by Formal Chicken.